From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Kristen Amiot. It's Monday, May 13. Pay us more or prepare for a shutdown. That's the warning from the Australian Federal Police Union. They're threatening to walk off the job if the government doesn't come to the party on pay and conditions. And that could leave airports, public premises and even Parliament House without protection. You can read that exclusive story by workplace editor Ewan Hannon at theaustralian.com.au. A Chinese researcher based at a Queensland university has been fighting deportation for 4 years. The government wants Zhao Longzhu gone because of his alleged links to weapons of mass destruction. Court documents show the researcher is the 5th visa applicant to be pursued by the government on similar grounds. Treasurer Jim Chalmers says he's got the balance right ahead of Tuesday's federal budget. But he'll break from the Reserve Bank's inflation forecasts and lean on consumers to do the heavy lifting and reduce spending in the second half of the year. So what's driving Jim Chalmers and what kind of budget will he deliver? That's today's episode. The 1996 film Jerry Maguire opens with a scene in which the titular sports agent, played by Tom Cruise, has what I guess you'd call an epiphany.
I began writing what they call a mission statement. Not a memo, a mission statement. You know, a suggestion for the future of our company. A night like this doesn't come along very often. I seized it.
Maguire makes copies of his mission statement and distributes them to every one of his colleagues in the middle of the night.
Copies. Even the cover looked like The Catcher in the Rye. I entitled it, "The Things We Think and Do Not Say. The Future of Our Business."
They love it. Management doesn't.
How long do you give him?
About a week.
In the run-up to his second federal budget in early 2023, Treasurer Jim Chalmers had a Jerry Maguire moment. He penned a 6,000-word essay laying out his vision for the future of capitalism.
Well, my essay is all about how we strengthen our economy and strengthen our institutions in a way that strengthens our society and strengthens our democracy.
It was also his vision for himself, writ large. In taking up the mantle as Treasurer, Chalmers said he doesn't want to be someone who just occupies the office. He wants to enable major change, be a big-time reformer. Now, we've passed the halfway mark of Labor's term in government. The next election isn't too far off, and Jim Chalmers' third federal budget will be handed down on Tuesday night. The question is if he's lived up to his own expectations.
I think this budget will be the most important that Jim Chalmers has brought down as Treasurer. It's important because the economic challenge is really significant.
Paul Kelly is the Australian's editor-at-large. He's been covering politics and federal budgets for 50 years.
But beyond that, it's the third year of the first term. So I think this budget is going to tell us more about the economic character of the government and of the Treasurer, and it's going to outline the essence of the future growth strategy for Labor, which it will pursue over the next several years. He's a gifted communicator as Treasurer. He's ambitious. He sees himself operating in the Paul Keating mould. He sees himself as a reforming Treasurer, but he's Treasurer at a very difficult time, a time when the challenge of high inflation inhibits and constrains what the government and what the Treasurer can do. And the essence of this coming budget will be how Chalmers reconciles the economics with the politics.
Looming over all this is the legacy of another former Treasurer and great reformer, Paul Keating.
Madam Speaker, last year the government paid back $3,700 million of Commonwealth debt. This year we'll pay back even more. We'll be able to do so because tonight I'm announcing a budget surplus of historic proportions.
Keating's been back in the news recently for his frank criticism of his Labor colleagues, most notably Foreign Minister Penny Wong's navigation of Australia's relationship with China.
Running around the Pacific Islands with a lei around your neck handing out money, which is what Penny does, is not foreign policy. It's a consular task, fundamentally. Foreign policy...
But he's been a mentor to Chalmers, even a bit of a hero. The Treasurer, who's actually Dr. Jim Chalmers, wrote his PhD on Keating's leadership style. It was titled Brawler Statesman, a nod to Keating's feisty and ambitious politics. But Keating's day has long since passed, and the economic, political and social landscapes are vastly different now.
Well, I think there's no harm in comparing them, and I think in one sense Jim Chalmers invites us to compare them. I think that's probably not a smart thing for him to be doing, because Keating was Treasurer 40 years ago. It was a different world and it was a different challenge. And essentially Keating's reform credentials have been unmatched ever since, and I don't think they're likely to be matched by the current government or, frankly, by Jim Chalmers himself. And in many ways he might privately agree with that particular point. But there's a deeper problem.
Their sense of destiny might match, but their agendas don't.
The Keating agenda was all about creating a new sense of Australian-based productivity, eliminating the tariff, opening up the Australian economy, giving more emphasis to market forces, cutting taxes, empowering the middle class, deregulating the financial system. Now, that is an agenda of enterprise-based innovation relying on markets. What we now see from the current Labor government, headed by Anthony Albanese with Chalmers as Treasurer, is that there's a greater emphasis on government, on spending, on government intervention. We have a government-directed new form of industry policy. We have a vast array of subsidies and tax breaks to encourage renewable energy and achieve the objective of a renewable energy superpower. So essentially we've got a lot of changes which many people would call reform, and others, particularly economists, would say they're examples of the country actually regressing, relying much more on old-fashioned government intervention and government spending. So I think that is the paradox of the Chalmers-Keating relationship.
Jim Chalmers has been setting the scene for this federal budget for months now. At a speech given at the Lowy Institute in early May, he said this is the most challenging strategic environment since World War II. And he's not wrong. Inflation is creeping, growth is slowing, conflict is escalating, geopolitical tensions are rising, and climate change is accelerating.
I think what he's getting at, and in this sense he's completely correct, that this is a very difficult economic environment for the government. And the reason it's difficult is because inflation is still not mastered. Of course, a lot of progress has been made, but the last mile in terms of beating inflation has not yet been reached. So essentially the problem that the Treasurer faces is the problem between putting in place new expansive policies designed to define what this Labor government stands for and help the Australian people on the one hand, and on the other hand, the fact that fiscal policy has got to do something to assist monetary policy and contain inflation, and that means there's got to be a limit on how much you can spend. So that's the dilemma.
Coming up, why Jim Chalmers' next move is less budget and more balancing act. While I've got you, don't forget subscribers to The Australian get first access to the best budget commentary and analysis. A subscription also unlocks newsletters and special events. You don't need to be the Treasurer to know it's great value. Check us out at theaustralian.com.au. We'll be back after this break. Last week, Reserve Bank Governor Michelle Bullock sent Treasurer Jim Chalmers a warning. She said the RBA would have to act if services costs and soaring petrol prices send inflation back up. And by act, she means hike interest rates.
We're not ruling anything in or out because things are uncertain, but there is just, the recent data have just indicated to us we need to be a little bit alert and vigilant on this.
The Reserve Bank's job is to set the cash rate. When it wants people to pump money into the economy, the rate drops. But when inflation is as high as it has been over the past year or so, spending is a dangerous game because everything gets more expensive as suppliers and service providers work to cover their costs. If that's allowed to go on for too long, those prices could stay that way. That's called stagflation. So the Reserve Bank does the only thing it can do. It raises interest rates so spending is diverted into mortgages. And that's putting huge amounts of pressure on Australian households. So what Michelle Bullock is saying to Jim Chalmers in the nicest way possible is don't put too much money in people's pockets. Here's Paul Kelly.
I think the Treasurer will present the budget as a middle course budget. That is, it's an effort to strike a compromise between the economics and the politics. Cost of living will be uppermost in the budget speech of the Treasurer, and he's made it clear that assistance to people managing cost of living pressures will be substantial. There's going to be a lot for families, for pensioners, for students, for young people, for industry, for older people. So the government will try and, in that sense, look after the community. That's important. But on the other hand, he's got to ensure that he doesn't spend too much. And I think what we're going to say about this budget when we see it on Tuesday is that with this budget, the Treasurer has taken political responsibility for any future increases in interest rates by the Reserve Bank, because we know that the more spending you have, then the more that puts pressure on the Reserve Bank to increase interest rates. So the great danger for the Treasurer, the great risk for the Albanese government in this budget is that it's going to put more pressure on demand in the economy. And that means if the Reserve Bank does have to increase interest rates again, that in political terms is going to be sheeted back to the government. That's the risk, that's the gamble.
In other words, Jim Chalmers will be walking a tightrope on Tuesday night.
I think there are probably two fundamental factors which might define this budget historically. First of all, how will this budget be judged in terms of combating the central economic problem, which is inflation? Now, we won't be able to answer that exactly on Tuesday night. The answer will emerge over the course of the next year or two. And I think the second fundamental criteria is that this budget will probably have a strong ideological component in terms of outlining what Labor stands for and what Labor believes in. I mean, the interesting thing about the budget is the biggest single item in the budget in terms of quantum of money will be the tax cuts. But the revamped tax cuts were announced last January. So they're old news, but in actual fact, they'll be the biggest single item in the budget. And that's another item which points to the question of the economic character of the government. So I think the second way to judge this budget will be as an insight into the government's fundamental economic character, what it believes in and what its future growth strategy is.
Peter Dutton will have his chance to respond to the new federal budget on Thursday. And Paul says the opposition leader has some work to do too.
So essentially what you see a lot of pretty busy, almost panicked work over the Wednesday and the Thursday from the opposition leader to sort out how far they go in the budget reply. This is what it's always like, and it won't change this week. But the big question is, what does Dutton say about what the Dutton leadership is about and what the Liberal Party stands for at this point in time? What will he say about policies? What will he say about tax, immigration, spending, about energy, and so on? And this is always the tactical dilemma that opposition leaders face with their Thursday night reply to the budget. How far do they go? Now, I think Peter Dutton's got to go some way. We haven't seen very much at all from the Liberal Party in terms of what they stand for, in terms of their policy rollout. Now, that's sensible in one sense because oppositions never like to do that too much. But on the other hand, I think Dutton's got an obligation to give us something. And that's going to be the issue How much will he give us? We'll have to wait and see on Thursday night.
Paul Kelly is The Australian's editor-at-large. The Front will be in Canberra for the federal budget tomorrow night. And you can follow our experts' reporting and analysis live at theaustralian.com.au.